Welcome, Farewell fans. It's your host, MNG, and I have another great interview for you today. And I want to be able to provide some of the best content for you and making sure that it's well-rounded and you have the best information so you can grow. So today I have Jason Gibler with me today. And Jason, thank you for coming on to the show.
Thank you so much, MNG. It's great to be here. Super glad to get to talk with you.
Now, I want to kind of jump right into it. So, can you just share a bit about your background and what led you to specialize in working with dads and couples as a psychotherapist?
Well, I've been in the therapy world for quite some time. I started probably 25-ish years ago.
Okay.
And my first job that I had in therapy was I was working at a transitional home for youth that had been incarcerated. And they had both young males and they also had young females. And I actually worked on the female side. So there was a lot of moms with babies that
Mm,
were, they're 16, 17 years old, but they, in a lot of trouble. And, they've been in jail and then they're trying to be a mom and, really, really hard and trying to get their education. So that was kind of my first exposure to the field. And then after that, I worked with homeless and runaway youth, so a lot of kids that were just struggling, so I've always had a real heart for young people, young parents. And then over the years, I started doing, I went on to get my master's degree and got my, license in counseling, in clinical psychology. And then right off the bat, I started working with parents, especially dads, around, things like childbirth and child loss and all of that. And I had a real specialty in couples. I think that, fathers are really underserved a lot.
yes.
And part of that is because dads don't reach out that much for help.
Yeah.
So it became an area that I really, really wanted to work in because I just see the deep need there.
And, I'm glad you said that because, as a father, I understand that there is this stigma for men or fathers. Let's just keep it consistent to do it by themselves and not seek help.
Yep.
Even when it comes to the court system, unless they really have to go and get an attorney, they have to be advised to go and get an attorney in some situations. Even speaking to my situation, I walked into the court system and my first mindset was, man, I should get an attorney. But
Hmm.
then you hear a lot of people say, well, you can just do it yourself and you can go in there and you can talk on your own behalf. But that's not always the case because you don't know the legal jargon
Hmm.
as well. You don't know what the case process is.
Right.
And it can get really confusing. It can get intimidating.
Absolutely.
So so I would implore all men to seek some level of counseling when it comes to certain cases that they have, whether it's child support or whatnot, even in relationships, to seek some level of counsel regarding your relationship. Because let's be honest, everybody is walking around with some level of trauma,
Yeah.
and and there are men, even when it comes to some men and their health concerns, sometimes it just goes unaddressed.
Yeah, it does a lot. It's interesting to me, like as you were talking, I'm thinking about a lot of the dads that I've helped, and I've helped dads with kids of all ages, but especially have this, specialty around childbirth, and you know, there's been a huge change in parenting over the last, say, 20 years. You
Yes.
know, men are way more involved in, even, if they're in relationship, a lot of times they're, doing things their dads would never do, like changing diapers and feeding babies in the middle of the night and, all this stuff. Or maybe they stay up at night while, mom is sleeping, because they're trying to, be good. They're trying to help, but what happens is often, a guy, it'll be like 2 a.m. and he's been struggling with the baby, for example, for 3 hours trying to get it to sleep. And he feels like he has to do it on his own. Like he can't even ask his partner, hey, I'm struggling here. Because we've all been taught that we're supposed to, be tough, be strong, we got it together, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that's a myth, that men always tend to follow, is this idea that, I have to have it together, and if I don't have it together, I sure can't tell anybody about that, because I've got to
Hmm.
put on a face that shows that I have it together.
And and just to think about just to think about that idea of being a man and never having to ask for help,
Hmm.
never really having anyone to say that you can lean on, because it's just always just been either innate or it's been just taught to you and force fed to you as, no, you a man, you got to stand tall. You can't you can't ask for help. You can't show any kind of weakness, because ask for help is a level of weakness.
For
And
sure.
I like how, and I've seen it change in the ties too. You know,
Hmm.
man, there was a time where man or baby or the father of children had the stigma of, oh, well, they can just walk away, they don't want to be a part of it. But now
Yep.
you have men that's fighting to be in their kids' lives. You have men that are fighting to get custody of their kids, because they see that them as a provider, they can have the support system, or they can figure it out and actually be and could possibly be the better parent for the children, for the children.
Absolutely, and often they are. Man, there's not that much support out there for that. And you mentioned the courts, and a lot of times the courts are not going to actually see that the dad could be the better partner.
Right.
There's still that residual where there's a preference to the mom usually, and that's really not fair to the kids or the dad. You know what I mean?
Now, and even in those situations, they don't do the actual background work to determine whether the person is unfit or not. Because they used to do it, at a time. They
Yeah.
used to do wellness checks. They used to go to the house and, look at some things. They may do it in dire situations, but it's
Hmm.
not as prevalent as it used to be way back when. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's information that I've researched, and I knew women that work in social work, how they used to go out to the houses to make sure that that the environment was stable, and that they wasn't doing anything else to offset the money that they were getting
Hmm.
from the government and everything, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting how, the courts only can help so much. And, of course, they're very busy and we know that, and they're overwhelmed.
Yeah.
So, they're oftentimes they're just trying to look for how can we move this case on? I really think that that's true. And, you know, um, working in human services, most of us kind of feel like, oh, the court, maybe they'll do the right thing. But, that's not always the case. You know what I
It's not.
mean?
It's not. And I don't want anybody to take this as like I'm coming down on the court system.
Yeah.
It's
Hmm.
not what I'm doing. It's more so a fact that even depending on the evidence that you walk in with,
Yeah.
or the information you walk in with, you have to make sure that the information that you're citing abides by the law that they're administering.
Yeah.
Okay,
Hmm.
because certain things are just looked at certain ways.
Hmm.
Like text messages. There was a situation where I was having a conversation with my son's mother, and I showed it to the attorney, and the attorney said, "Hey, it looks like you're leading her into a conversation, and the judge is not going to accept that into evidence." And I'm like,
Hmm.
well, what do you mean? She's willingly telling me this.
Hmm.
That's how I'm looking at it. She's willingly giving me this information, but you're literally telling me that I'm baiting her to get the information. And, it can look like coercion, it can look like manipulation.
Yeah.
And the judge will say, you know what, is inadmissible, because you can't, you're leading this person to tell you more information so you can make them look bad.
Hmm.
And you run it, and everybody, and even though everybody want to use text messages, look at the text message that they sent me, and look at what they said, and you know it's a threat, or is this, is that, how valid is it? But it's not valid, because it looks like the person is being led into a trap to make them look bad.
Absolutely. And I think thing that as I'm listening to you, I'm just thinking about the adversarial nature of the courts, right?
Yeah.
It's always like somebody's on one side or the other. and of course you got to put your argument forward and all that, and then the judge just has to like figure out, okay, well, who's telling the truth and what, and it's a really hard thing. But one of the things I do working with couples is I'm always trying to help people learn how to have, challenging conversations with one another,
Mm,
that actually create connection rather than disconnection,
right.
and I think that that's really important, and especially for dads, and especially if you're maybe you're not with your partner anymore, and it can be really adversarial, right? And then of
Hmm.
course that's not
Hmm.
good for the kids. And so the question is, how do you have a challenging conversation with somebody that shows that there's some boundaries there, that there's some things that we both need to adhere to, but also that creates connection.
Right. So, speaking of couples and everything, what are some common themes or challenges you notice amongst the fathers you work with?
Well, so I work with a wide array of dads, but I think we already kind of touched a little bit on one of the most common, and it's this idea of isolation.
Yeah.
Kind of being on your own emotionally. So like even if you're in a really good, super committed relationship, often men feel alone because they're just not used to sharing what's going on, and I don't know about you, but I know for me growing up, sharing your feelings was probably the last thing you possibly wanted to do, especially on the
Yeah.
playground, somebody punch you. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? It's like,
Yeah. Yeah.
we've learned over the years, not to share our feelings, you know what I mean? And so what happens is, we not only do men not share feelings, but they're also disconnected from their own emotions. So
Mm,
part of the way that, the thing that is changing, but I think it's really important, is even learning to figure out, okay, what do I feel? Because sometimes, with a lot of guys that I work with, there's certain emotions that are like fine and dandy, like being angry, or
yeah.
maybe, kidding around and laughing at your friends or whatever. But actually telling somebody, hey, well, I'm feeling really down right now, or hey, I'm kind of anxious about something, or I don't know what to do with my kid. You don't hear that much, from guys.
Yeah. So there's something you said that, so we talked, so isolation
Mhm.
and emotions. There are certain emotions that I find it dandy, then there's certain emotions that are not, right?
Mhm.
What emotions are you what emotions are you referring to?
Yeah. Well, so kind of a way to describe this is, it's different levels of emotion. So there's surface or hot emotions that come out pretty often when we're struggling. So say for example, we want something and it doesn't go our way, we might get mad, we get angry. But typically underneath that, there's a different emotion, and that can be maybe sadness or anxiety or something along those lines, right?
Right.
So one of the things that we can really learn as men to do is identify the underlying emotion. So like, let's say, we're trying to connect with somebody, maybe a partner, whatever, and, it just doesn't feel like they're hearing us, or, it doesn't feel like they're getting what, is going on. If we can say, okay, what I'm really feeling isn't the anger that's coming up for me. It's the fact that I feel alone here, and I don't feel seen, and I don't feel like they get me. And, that makes me feel, maybe even a little scared, because I want to be understood. You know what I mean?
Right. Okay. Now I do get that,
Hmm.
because if you're in a relationship, okay, for example, you're in a relationship, you're having these conversations, and but your voice is not being heard when you're vocalizing. So let's just say that the person is very comfortable and can be vulnerable with their spouse, right?
Yeah.
And they're vocalizing that, hey, I don't feel like I'm being heard. I don't feel like you're actually hearing the things that I say when, I'm saying that there's issues within this relationship and they want to talk about it. And they're open and honest about it, but the other person isn't really receiving the information well.
Yeah.
And through receiving information, they're um they're chastising the person, or they're making fun of them for having these emotions, for being vulnerable, for being open, for acknowledging how they feel about something, which then inadvertently shuts the person down,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
And And I'll be honest, I believe even for myself, if I'm being open and honest and vulnerable about something, and what I'm saying is not being heard, or there's an issue even from the spouse's perspective, and I hear it, I acknowledge it, but then there's some criticism that comes behind it. I don't want to share anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty easy to go into that shutdown place, and it's really normal. And there's a common cycle that often happens. Like, one partner will maybe shut down, and then the other person might get amped up, because they're shutting down, and that's kind of how arguments and conflicts can really erupt because if
Mhm.
someone is shutting down, the other person is like, well, I got to tell you, what I need to keep talking to you till I help you understand what I'm saying, and they're not understanding, and then you can that can really amp it up, you know what I mean, and then the other person can shut down more. So this is a common pattern in couples work that I always work with all the time, and one of the ways to help with this is just to recognize the pattern,
Mhm.
because we have these patterns that we do over and over and over again, and we're like, here we are again, we're fighting about the same old thing. I'm not feeling understood, you're not feeling like I care or whatever, and we've had this argument 1,000 times. If that's happened, we know that we're in a pattern.
Right.
And one thing you can do when you know that you're in a pattern is you can look at the pattern as the issue, not the person that you're in the pattern with.
Mm. Now, see, I'm gonna be honest. I be looking at the person. Like,
No
I be
doubt.
like, that person is a problem, and we need to find somebody else. Like, it's the person.
Yeah.
It's the person.
Hmm.
And from that, if you don't recognize the pattern and you do think it's a person, then your first mindset is that this relationship is not working, y'all incompatible, and then you want to go and you want to find something else.
Yep.
But really, on a different level, it could be a communication issue. It could
Hmm.
be a understanding, comprehension issue.
Yep.
It could be perspective. Somebody just believes that they're right all the time.
Yep.
And it can be any party. Like, well, I'm always right. I don't understand, or I can't see your perspective. So why do we keep arguing about it? Because I'm not going to agree with you.
Yeah.
And you have those, as you said, pattern explosions
Hmm.
over and over and over again, with the same conversations happening over and over and over again, until eventually both parties are like, know what? Let's just go ahead and part because we're not seeing eye to eye on this situation.
Yeah. And then often what happens is they'll get a new partner, and then the same thing happens again, right? Because you haven't identified the pattern that you're falling into. And so then you end up subconsciously picking somebody who has that same trait that makes you feel the same way, and so you're back in the cycle even if with a new person.
That's true. So
Yeah.
now let me ask you this. And we talked about briefly about fathers seeking help. So for those fathers who may be reluctant to seek help, now what advice would you offer that to just encourage them to take the first step?
Well, I think that often when, dads come up against a thing where they know they need help, um, they often think of it as weakness. Like, they'll look at, oh, I'm not going to do therapy. Like, I don't need that, or I don't need to go to any kind of support group. I mean, those guys, I mean, they're losers or whatever. They have this really negative thought in their mind about it, right?
Right.
Uh, so first off, what I think is, you know, being willing to look at your stuff and being willing to have somebody else help you see something maybe that you can't see is not weakness at all. It's courage, you know, it's super
Mhm.
courageous. And, and you and I were talking a little bit about cycles, right? So there's so many cycles that get passed down generationally, you know,
Yes. Yeah.
dads that do the same thing and that their dad did, and then they pass it on to their kid, and and there's all this trauma, like you mentioned, this trauma that happens over and over and over. But what if, you know, you and I and maybe every guy that's listening to this said, no, I'm going to change that. I'm
Yeah.
not going to pass that on.
Yeah.
Now, how courageous would that be, to say, this is where this thing stops.
And speaking of cycles, so I believe that I was in a cycle. My dad had me at 21.
Hmm.
I had my son at 21, and I knew what the cycle was at that point in time. I was like, okay, my dad had me at 21. I
Mhm.
had a child at 21. I know I don't want the next generation to have a child at 21. You
Mhm.
know, and I've been kind of consistently on my son's head, like, look, we not having no kids at
Mhm.
21. Let's shoot for 25.
Yeah,
Let's
for sure.
shoot-
Mhm.
let's get some things kind of settled first, so far as career, housing, no transportation, before we start just popping out kids, and then you're rushing or you're running to try to get things together in
Yeah.
a short amount of time, right?
Mhm.
Because I know he will want to be active in his child's life, and the only way to be active sometimes is to be in the same location, so you have that everyday impact, right?
For sure.
Now, talking about seeking advice. Now, my dad was born in the 60s. Okay.
Mhm.
Now he has me and he has two other kids that's twins. Right.
Mhm. Mhm.
And when talking to my dad, I realized that he is of the opinion that he doesn't need help
Yeah.
for anything. Okay.
Mhm.
Well, unless it's technology, then he'll call me and say he need help with technology. You
Yeah.
know, maybe he can't turn the TV on because the remote control batteries died and he ain't figured it out. Time cases, right?
Mhm.
But he needs help. Okay. Now
Yeah.
there are a lot of different things that I have had conversations with my dad on, and I realized that from a generational standpoint, that's just where he's at.
Yeah.
You know, 60 something years old, don't want any help, don't want to change, not seeking to resolve certain things because he's so stuck in his ways.
Yeah.
But then I also meet people like that that's in my age group
Mhm.
that don't want any help, don't want to seek help. They think that they are okay, that they're good in any sense. I have a close friend, and I've been trying to help them find like a new job position, right?
Mhm.
Because I'm like, okay, what a job position you have is just, you know, you can make more, okay?
Yeah.
And the crazy part about it is that in offering them assistance, they have either botched the interview or just counted themselves out of the whole race. Even if I said that, look, I can get you an interview because I got a connection. I can get
Yeah.
you the door. Everything else is on you.
Mhm.
Just no job description ain't good. But doesn't want the help.
Yeah.
When we talk about relationships, when we talk about personal growth, relationships aren't easy, right?
Mhm.
And in comparison, relationships 50, 60, I will even go 80 years ago, were completely different than relationships now.
Yeah.
Back then, you didn't have all of the temptation that would drive you to talk to somebody else, cheat, whatever the case is, right?
Yeah.
But then the communication there was always a smaller circle. You know, it was
Mhm.
always in a smaller area of community. So you couldn't venture too far out, right?
Right.
In today's time, it's harder to maintain a relationship because there's a lot of temptation out there.
For sure.
And it's easier to break up with somebody and seek somebody new than to stay in that relationship and keep working at it. Even if there are a and they could be a great person. They could be great for you, but
Yeah.
you gonna see something online and think that that's way better for you and to be on your arm. So it's a lot harder now to do it than it was then.
Mhm.
Short story. I got a lot of stories today. I work with a guy that he was dating this girl. They were dating for a year. I don't know if he's still with her. I hope he is. They were dating for a year. And he told me that they went to therapy together.
Mm.
And I said, well, why? He's like, well,
Mhm.
you know, we live together. We want to make it work. So we
Yeah.
decided to go to therapy. And at the time, and let me tell you, this was about maybe 8, 9 years ago. I thought it was the craziest thing. I'm like, you only dated her for a year. If it ain't working out, keep going, just keep going.
Yeah.
But this was an individual that really wanted a relationship. They both really wanted a relationship. They were just having issues that they couldn't get past. And they went and seek therapy. And at the time, it blew my mind. But as I think about it today, I'm like, man, just imagine the relationship that people could have had they go seek that help to find out where's the breakdown at,
Yeah.
where is the communication error, right?
Hmm.
And go from there. Fathers, being fathers, going to seek help from other fathers, being in communities with other fathers to learn how to be a better father, be a better communicator, just be a better overall, and learning from other dads.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing. As you're talking about all that and telling a story about your friend and also talking about your dad, a couple things came up for me that I thought maybe we could chat a little about.
Okay.
And one of them is shame and the other is
Mhm.
masking behavior, right?
Okay. Shame
Um,
and masking behavior. Okay.
yeah. Yeah. So often I think why men don't seek help is because there's a sense of shame around it. Like there's something wrong with me and that's embarrassing, and it's like if anybody knew, that I had a problem, you know what I mean? It's like
Right.
this heavy feeling of shame. And often when you hear somebody, say, well, I don't need help. I got it together. That's because they don't want to acknowledge any kind of weakness, and so
Mm.
they might feel like there's like if anybody knew that I had a problem, that'd be terrible. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so then that dovetails with this idea of masking behavior. And you kind of alluded to this, with all the stuff that, we face today. Like there's so much, it's so easy to like jump on a porn site, it's so easy to,
Yeah.
see another woman. It's so easy to, drink too much or, take some drugs or whatever. It's so easy. And all these ways are to mask, what's going on. And so when I mentioned to you earlier, like emotions that are on the surface and ones that are hidden below, you know, we might have this strong emotion up on the surface and we're like, oh man, I'm pissed off. Well, let me go take a couple drinks,
Mm-hmm.
but what's underneath is being masked even from the person who's feeling it. And so they're numbing it out. Like, I'm numbing out what I feel so I don't have to face it. And that is the definition of mental illness. That's the thing that messes people up is because they're avoiding their own stuff by doing all kinds of masking behavior. And it's because they're really truthfully afraid of what's there.
Wow. I didn't even think of it like that. The fear of being shamed or
Hmm.
feeling shame
Yeah.
results in masking behaviors.
Yep. Hmm.
So if I don't want to feel ashamed, so let me just provide clarity for the fans.
Yeah.
If there's something that I don't know, and I feel like if I admit that I don't know it, or I admit that I feel a certain way, that I'm gonna feel ashamed of myself for doing it.
Yeah.
And in lieu of being honest and forward with myself, I'm gonna mask the behavior with something else.
Yep.
That
Yeah.
is deep.
Yeah.
That is deep.
Yeah. And that's kind of like even as you're saying deep, I'm imagining like a pit, it's like you're sliding into this quicksand,
Yes.
of, of your own making in a way because you're avoiding what's there. And then you create a whole new set of problems, by doing the masking.
That brings up a very interesting story that I'm gonna share with you. I was engaged at one point in time,
Mm-hmm.
and we had a communication breakdown. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
she left, right? Just completely walked out, left. Instead of dealing with my emotions and and crying it out, because we are told as men we're not supposed to cry, right?
Yep. For
We had
sure.
bottled it in.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of feeling what I had to feel, I suppressed it.
Yeah.
Okay. I had to finish school. I had to buckle down and I had to suppress it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't admit what I was going through. I couldn't admit that I was hurt. People kept asking me, are you okay? And I'm like, yeah, I'm good,
Yeah.
it's fine. Or I'll say, I cried last night, it's good.
Mm-hmm.
But you know what it turned into?
Tell me.
It turned into alcohol addiction.
Mm.
It turned into alcohol addiction.
Yeah.
And, for 3 months, it increasingly just got worse and worse and worse and worse. And the crazy part about the association of it is that I didn't notice how bad it gotten until I was well past my limit and I was at work.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And not at work like being belligerent or anything. I mean at work, reeking of alcohol and sleep.
Wow.
And this was about 10 this is about 10 years ago. There were 10, 11 years ago that it happened. And it was a very dark period, because once I came to a realization that what I was going through, I had no choice but to admit and say, man, I need to feel this.
Mm-hmm.
I need to acknowledge this. And some of it was I need to talk to her so I can understand like why we were engaged. Why did it just end so easily as if we were just in a regular relationship, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I will say that some of it was on my part. Now, I
Mm-hmm.
know some people be out there looking at this and say, well, what did you do, MNG? Like, it was your fault too. You had a part to play. You're right. I had a part to play in it. And it wasn't as bad as her just walking out and we're not communicating with it.
Right.
It's kind of on the same playing field. But what
Mm-hmm.
happened to me afterwards, not admitting it because I feel shame. I feel, I feel embarrassed. I feel stupid. Here I did, love a person, gave them everything, gave them my heart, gave them my all, and they just left.
Yeah.
How does that look like to everybody?
Mm-hmm.
Everybody
Right.
that I shared this conversation with, everybody I done shared this experience with. How bad does that make me look? So no,
Mm-hmm.
I'm a mask it. I'm only going to give so much of it, and then turn straight to alcohol to further suppress and numb everything that I was going through.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that, MNG. I really appreciate you being real and vulnerable about like that, because that sounds like a super painful experience. And, you just masked it. Like we were talking about, it's like, this feels terrible and I can't be real about it at the moment.
Right.
And so then you went to the alcohol, which
Yeah.
is what a lot of men do, you know?
And it's the, and you're right. I seen my dad do it.
Yeah.
You know,
Hmm.
um, and he's told me that there's some dark periods in his life that I won't really go into, out of his privacy. But
Yeah.
there's some dark spaces in his life, um, where as he told me about the stuff, and some of it was due to child support,
Yeah.
not being able to, have the necessities that you would need to live comfortably,
Yeah.
because child support is taking so much from you
Hmm.
that you can't have some of the basic necessities to feel comfortable.
Absolutely.
You
Yeah,
know,
and it's
how
kind
do
of
you
a hopeless feeling, right? I mean, it can be really hopeless because you're like, what? I don't have, I don't even have enough money to take care of myself, and I got to, send it away. And um, it's interesting too. Like as you were talking, about your story and that episode you went through, I could hear the grief in that, and so part of that is like maybe unprocessed grief. We were talking a little bit about how to deal with that and how that's so hard for men, but
Yes,
losing a relationship can cause a lot of grief. And if you've been taught, oh, well, I can't let anybody know, that I'm feeling something,
yeah,
then, of course, the first thing you're going to do is try to avoid the feelings, because we're also taught we're supposed to get over stuff quickly. Right.
yes, yes,
Um, and that, there's something wrong with you if you can't get over it, that kind of stuff. These are some of the things that really make it hard to deal with any kind of grief.
Yeah. And it's not just grief. From my own experience, it's not just grief. It's grief. It is reluctance.
Mm-hmm.
It's trust. You're reluctant to go into the next relationship with
Yeah.
trust.
Mm-hmm.
You're still holding on to what you let go,
Yeah.
right? And even as you're trickling forward, there's these. I'll speak for me. I can't speak for everybody else, but there's these periods of time where you're reminded that you're not worth a great relationship.
Yeah.
Because when somebody walks away from you with no words,
Mm-hmm.
no rhyme or reason, you question everything you do and who you are.
Absolutely.
And without the realization, I'll say on record that 5 years after that happened, I had another good relationship, and I walked away from that one. We was together for a year, walked away from that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Went to therapy after that to find out what was wrong that I was doing for what I would say good relationships to go away. Because I feel like I was to blame. I looked at myself as if I was to blame for
Yeah.
these relationships coming to an end,
Yeah.
and had to learn tips, tricks, techniques in order to try to figure out, how to maintain, not only maintain and understand myself, but maintain and understand like where I'm going and what do I even want out of a relationship? What do I want out of a person?
Yeah. That's so interesting. I'm so glad you went to therapy and looked into that. As you were talking, you brought up something really, really important. I think that, people would be valuable for them to understand this idea. And essentially, it's the core wound of unworthiness, that many, many people feel,
Yep.
this sense, like you said, like there's something wrong with me, or I'm not good enough, or I'm the one who keeps ruining everything, or, and that's hidden, in our subconscious, but it shows up. And,
Mm-hmm.
we end up creating situations that prove that to us, that we're no good,
Yeah.
you know?
Time and time again,
Hmm.
you you you'll walk that line, or you'll walk into that situation believing
Yeah.
that this situation is not right for you.
Yeah. And, when we think about, what we all need as humans, there's this idea of the science of human bonding, right? It's like, what do we need? What do we need? What we need is to feel safe and
Mhm.
feel loved and feel like, somebody has our back. Somebody really cares about us. Somebody is on our side no matter what we do. Even if we do something really idiotic and, find ourselves in jail or something, we still need somebody to say, hey, you're okay. I got you. I still believe in you, you know?
Yes. And I and that's why I believe that men need a support system of
Yeah,
other men.
for sure.
Not just one, not just two, like a whole community
Hmm.
of men need to come together, reach out and say, hey, I'm feeling some kind of ways.
Yeah.
I can't
Hmm.
necessarily put my finger on it, but I need to talk to somebody.
Yeah.
Or I had a conversation with my son, or I had a conversation with my daughter, or my son did this, my daughter did that, and I don't know how I should react to the situation.
Yeah.
We are in a in an era where there's a lot going on so far as sexual orientation.
Yeah.
And as men, when you have a daughter that wants to be a boy, or a boy that wants to be a daughter, who do you have those conversations with to actually grasp and understand that your child wants to assume a different identity?
Yeah. That's a
Like that,
really hard one.
it's really hard to accept. And then this is something that is being addressed in the social masses,
Hmm.
in different social circles, right?
Right.
As a parent, as a father, and I had a conversation with my son. I said, son, because I'm gonna be honest, I ain't seen my son with a girl. Okay.
Hmm.
Like I seen him, he had a whole bunch of female friends and everything. He wasn't really dating until he got to high school. Then I was like, okay, but I told him, I said, listen, if you're gay, let me know now.
Hmm.
It's easier for me to step if you're younger
Yeah.
than when you're older and you come home with a guy. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to have
Mhm.
a conversation ahead of time so we get around the curve. And he
Right.
was like, "No, Dad, I'm not gay or anything." And I know
Mm.
it's hard for a lot of fathers to have that conversation with their kids because it's a hard acceptance
Yeah.
um, from any direction. And I can and I can only suspect that for couples that have kids together, for them to have to accept it is probably a little bit more difficult as well. Like it's a harder conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really challenging, and part of the thing that's happening a lot in our culture is there's just so much change happening, and with broader acceptance of different gender identities and orientations and all of that.
Yeah.
The younger generations are more exposed to that than the older generations, and so it can be a real difference for a
Yes.
parent trying to deal with that when a child maybe in middle school is being exposed to that much more often than maybe a parent is. And so some of it is really just learning from the kids. It's kind of like being willing to talk to your kid and listen to them and ask them what it's like for them, and with that kind of open-heartedness where you're not going to make them feel bad about you know what they're experiencing, or any kind of ideas they might have about their own gender identity or whatever. And it's just saying, hey, can we just have an open conversation you
Right.
know
And I think that's applicable in all situations.
yeah.
To have that open conversation, to have that checkup, to have that anything. When you're in a relationship, having that open conversation,
Hmm.
just so you can get anything on your mind off without any um, consequence, without any judgment
Yeah.
or anything. And I think that maybe that couples that are having issues or couples that want to have a healthy relationship
Yeah.
should spend once a month and just say, you know what, for the next hour or two, just say whatever is on your mind,
Yeah.
and let's talk about it. Let's have that open and honest conversation,
Hmm.
so we can become closer, and be better together.
Yeah, I think that that's so good. And a lot of the couples I work with do take specific time to do that on a regular basis, really trying to be real and open. And one of the things that really helps with this
Mm.
is having like kind of an attitude of non-blame. Like, I'm not going to blame you for my feelings. If I
Right.
have feelings showing up, I'm not going to say they're your fault. So I'm not going to say, hey, you raised your voice at me, so now I'm mad at you. I'm not going to say that. What I'm going to say is, I'm feeling something. This is what I'm feeling. I'm going to identify it. Maybe I'm feeling hurt or whatever. And I'm going to say, that's my feeling. I'm feeling hurt. I just want you to know that this came up between you and me. I'm not pointing the finger at you. I'm just telling you that that situation that we went through was hurtful to me, you know? Because one of the things that couples often do is, they just blame. It's like, I got to make sure that there's somebody's wrong. Someone's the person, the
Yeah.
bad person. And once that person changed their behavior, then we'll all be all right. But that never works,
Right.
because we all have our own perspective of what the other person might have done. And so if we can actually identify our own feelings and take ownership of them and say, this is my experience,
Hmm.
um, then we can actually work with it.
I agree. I agree. Every This is what I want to say to the farewell fans, to the man out there, to those that are in relationships. You are the owner of your own actions and
Hmm.
your own emotions, your own mental state. You can't put that on somebody else to have ownership of that. And by you being in control, what then happens is that not only can you control, you can assist the other person with regulating themselves, but you're in control. So the situation doesn't escalate more than that. You can be in an argument with somebody, and because you're not feeding off of their energy, you could possibly help settle them down.
Absolutely.
It's not always going to happen
Yeah.
because energy begets energy. So
Mhm.
that's how fights happen. So if one person is getting angry and then I'm getting angry and we're both yelling at each other, then the energy starts to become intense, and then it turns to something more than what it is.
Yeah.
But if one person is calm and the other person is yelling, they have nothing to feed off of. They're going to run out of steam, or they're going to find some kind of other outlet, which I know some people, they like to throw stuff. So if they can't get to get to the same energy level, they'll throw something at you to see if you can get to the same energy level.
Right. Yeah. Um, it's interesting hearing you talk about that, because one of the things that really happens when you start to say, okay, my emotions are mine, they're nobody else's fault, is that first you get to identify what you're feeling.
Mm-hmm.
But secondly, this is the really important part, is you get choice, right?
Yes.
So you get to choose. Like, so if someone's yelling at you, you could yell back and that might just be a reaction. Or
Yes.
you could just notice, oh, they're yelling at me. That doesn't feel good to me. What do I choose? Maybe I say to them, hey, I don't know that I can have this conversation with if you're going to be yelling. Can we come back to this in a little bit? When we're all feeling a little better.
Yeah.
But you get to choose, and that's the key is, accepting reality for what it is. I've got a feeling, and then slowing down enough, taking a deep breath, and saying, what do I want to do about it? What do I choose here?
Right. So, Jason, what is one piece of advice you want to give to fathers at any aspect or any level of fatherhood? And what is one piece of advice you want to give to relationships, to couples that are either in happy relationships and want to be more in tune, and couples that are trying to be more in tune but are kind of going through a growing period together?
Great, thank you for the two questions. And I would start with fathers. I really think that one of the things that we really need to start to work on is to really deeply connect to ourselves. So you and I have kind of talked about this throughout this talk. This is really a thread for me, that if we can connect with our own feelings, if we can connect even with the parts of ourselves that we're not too happy about, or even, things that we have done that we feel bad about, that we've never forgiven ourselves for, if we can learn how to do that, if we can learn how to be there for ourselves and be, kind to ourselves, that extrapolates out to couples, to being a dad, to being a good member, of society. It's like, because
Mhm.
what we're doing is when we're connected deeply to ourselves, then we can connect to others. So that
Right,
would be my first advice for dads, and really men in general, is, you know, know that you are a very complex, deeply emotional being. All people are. And,
right,
often men are told, okay, well, women are better at emotions than men are, and that's just not true. It's just that they've been allowed to be more in tune with their emotions. And so we have to be in tune with our emotions, because they do drive everything.
right,
And so the more you learn about your own feelings and about who you are, the better person you're going to be in the world. So that would be my advice for men and dads. And
yeah,
also to reach out for help when you need it. We talked about that. It's like, you're not supposed to be on a solo journey. Life is, we're all in this together, and there are people that care and that want to help. And so reach out to them. Um, as far as couples, I think what I would really say is that looking at that what's happening between you, not as, a struggle between two people, but more so as a pattern that we fall into over and over again, recognizing, almost looking at it as if it's on a big screen TV, and you're sitting back and watching it. It's like, okay, this is what I do. When they say this is how I react. When I say that, that's how they react. And just noticing it almost like an observer,
hmm,
because when we can observe something in a kind of a neutral way without getting all worked up, then we have a chance to change it.
right,
And first place to change is ourselves, because as we change ourselves, then we can create deeper connection.
hmm,
And know that even like the negative behavior you see, like, maybe someone's like yelling or, getting frustrated or whatever, behind that behavior is probably a need to feel safe and seen and cared for. So if you can be present, if you can seek to understand, if you can care about what they're experiencing, even if it's bothering you,
Yeah.
then I think you'd be on the right track.
Okay. And that is all. That's all great advice. That's all great advice, Jason. I want to thank you for coming onto the show, having this conversation. I mean, this has been great. Honestly, this has really been great. Pharaoh fans, thank you for tuning in. You know, we appreciate all the subscribers that are out there and everything. Once again, Jason, I want to say thank you for coming onto the show. We really appreciate it. Um,
Yeah.
is there anything you want to offer the Pharaoh fans? Because you're a wealth of information.
Yeah. Well, thank you for so much, MNG, for having me on your show. And I'm really, just really grateful that you would make this available, to your listeners, and hopefully it'll help people out there. That's really what I want to do, is offer something of value.
Yes.
So, they can come to my website, jasongibler.com. That's Gibler1B. And they can find me there. I've got a lot of resources there on my work and how I help people. They can also go to my counseling site, which is called Ayana Counseling, and that's AIYANA counseling.com. And there's a lot of resources for dads,
Mm,
especially.
yeah.
And I'm going to put some stuff up on, working with some of these emotions and stuff. So you'll get a free download if you go on there, and some of the stuff that we talked about, I'll create a little PDF and people can pop on there, and they can get that, and they can start working with these things.
Okay, and we'll also go ahead and put that information in the description if you didn't catch it. So we will catch you on the next go around. Peace.
All right. Take care. Thank you.